In the lands between, we explored how pertinent the body and identity are as themes to Elden Ring. And in the land of shadow, things are no different. For in the veiled home of Marika's betrayal, we are led by Needle Knight Leda to follow Miquella's passage toward the Gate of Divinity, where he too seeks to usher in an age of his own, an age of compassion, one that would dictate the bodies and faculties of everyone in the lands between. And like his stepsister Ranni's own ambition, he hopes to achieve freedom from the meddling fingers of the outer gods and the greater will, the process for which sees the children of Marika and Radagon both forego their flesh, for change can only come at the cost of the stardust all men are composed of. In Miquella we see not just the physical components of self abandoned either, we also come to find love and fear, the former embodied by Saint Trina, Miquella's aspect other half. Through the burnt remains of Messmer's crusade, we're going to explore Miquella's ascent to godhood and everything that would entail, as well as some of the characters, imagery and symbols we missed out on last time, which would further embolden our claim that Elden Ring is a game about the body. Because it is no coincidence that the runic essence that powers all beings resembles the iris of an eye, and our pursuit of this power takes us across a myriad of tarnished and runebearers alike, all seeking some agency and mastery over their form and their freedom. Last time we talked about characters like Godfrey and Godric, patriarch and distant offspring respectively, who explore questions of identity and wholeness of character in their lore and their arcs. We also looked at Ranni and Godwyn, two Empyrean bodies at the mercy of autonomy. We explored Marika and the motivations behind a Golden Order, who sought to right the torturous wrongs of Hornsent society, subjugators of her kind, her agenda made possible by the Erdtree and her status as an Empyrean. And of course we acknowledge that the envoys of the celestial body that makes its claim to the lands between are literal fingers, here to transcribe and dictate the word of God. If you didn't watch the first part, I really recommend it. It sets the foundation for our investigation, and the 5 lines before this don't really do it justice. The main takeaway from that first video though is that all of the game's major characters explore the theme of body and identity in one way or another. We also outlined the peculiarities of death and birth in the lands between. There were a lot of leftovers that we didn't get to in the first part, like Renalla and her pursuit of life and rebirth, the Omen-born twins who were plagued by the identity of the Old World Order, and Malenia, the scarlet-rotted blade of Miquella. We'll pick up on these characters today, as well as looking to the land of shadow, where the body is never far from view either. Our principal theme can be found in characters like the Hornsent, arbiters of the Crucible, whose mouldings and ideals differ greatly to the bodies that Marika would create. There is Messmer, who hides an ancient base abyssal serpent behind one of his eyes, and forget not Midra, the lord of frenzied flame, who has given up his very head in favour of existential true sight. But before we do all of this, I want to look at another theme that came up time and time again in the first video, and one that I think goes hand in hand with the game's overall exploration of the body and personal identity. And that is the theme of theology. Which goes without saying, is and has always been a massive part of Miyazaki's toolkit. Covenants and cults play a huge role in Dark Souls, and it's no secret that Elden Ring draws heavily from real-world religious texture. It's impossible to not see the parallel between Marika and the crucified image of Jesus seen throughout the lands between, or the constant references to serpents who harken back not just to Abrahamic religion, but also Norse world myths, of which the Erdtree also shares some of its roots. There's literally so much one could talk about when it comes to Elden Ring and religion, but that isn't the primary aim of the video. What I really want to show you is 3 stories from the Bible that, while not all explicitly about the body, do link back to it in some way, and I think help to strengthen our understanding of Miyazaki's work. Because when we're looking at the cast on Elden Ring stage, we see the creation of bodies as a core tenet of much of what we initially uncovered. For example, Marika's age is defined by a rejection of once desirable crucible traits like horns, scales and feathers, and ultimately decided by Radagon's pursuit of a golden fundamentalism, which would seek to fully understand the push and pull of causality, the how and why of our very being. And what is religion, if not a means to understand the origins of this being, our creation? Quick note to preface this section, I obviously am not a biblical historian, merely a video game enthusiast. I'm interpreting what I've read to the best of my ability, but please understand this is not my area of expertise, so I apologize if anything is misunderstood or misinterpreted. More than anything, I share these stories with you because I think they are interesting and help us to understand why Elden Ring is the way that it is, and I'm going to try and deliver that in an as easy and simple and coherent way as possible. I am conscious of the fact that we're not all here for Bible study. Final note, I owe much of this uncovering and investigation to viewer and friend BillyBoy597. Thank you so much for bringing any of this to my attention. I would have been none the wiser without your input. Okay, let's talk about religion. In Romans 11, Paul contextualizes the suffering of the ethnically Jewish as part of God's plan and as a means to provide salvation for the Gentile. The interesting part of this verse comes when Paul highlights two things. First, that those going against God's grace were given a spirit of stupor, eyes that could not see, and ears that could not hear, to this very day. A sort of madness is described here, one that is brought on by a lack of grace, which is something we see all throughout Elden Ring, that few still remain with the ability to see the guidance of grace in possession of all of their faculties. Without God, without divine guidance, we are supposedly lost, something that Elden Ring explores quite literally. The opposite of this is taken to its extremes in the blinding light of the three fingers, a guidance that utterly overwhelms. Paul goes on to say that the hardened have not been rejected by God, that if the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root, do not consider yourself to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this: you do not support the root, but the root supports you. Grafting trees and roots. Out of context, one can mistake this for a passage from the game. Just swap God out for the greater will and you're good. Paul's metaphor of the olive tree bears unmistakable similarity to texture that makes Elden Ring so fascinating, and we can see this ancient metaphor taken literally all throughout the game. Obviously, Godric the Grafted comes to mind, the final descendant of the Golden Lineage, seeking to make himself whole through the process of transplanting body parts onto himself, a bastardization of history at the end of the world. But we also see it when we consider the way in which the Golden Order was grafted, in a sense, onto the foundations of Crucible worship. Much like how the Abrahamic religions have evolved, splintered and changed over millennia, it still propagates from one seed, just like Elden Ring's great tree, whose wild roots lay the foundation of the Crucible and Hornsent society, the Tree's predecessor. But forget not that the root is the original covenant. It is the greater will in the Tree that supports the new order. This gives us a lot of context into the game's religious parallels and how life and order lay at the center. The other two stories I want to talk about go even further into contextualizing Miyazaki's inspirations and are the source for a major part of the game's bodily imagery. We look now to Daniel 4, which tells the story of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who receives a vision so terrifying he calls upon the ever-wise prophet Daniel to interpret it for him. In the king's dream, he sees an enormous tree reaching out to the top of the sky, providing an abundance of succor to all who would find refuge under its great boughs. However, a holy messenger descends from the heavens to will the tree be cut down, with the roots bound in iron and bronze to remain. The tree cut down and trimmed must be drenched with the dew of heaven and live amongst the animals, plants, and the earth. May his mind descend to that of an animal till 7 times pass, so that all living may know that God is the most high sovereign of all kingdoms on earth, tells the messenger. Daniel interprets the dream for King Nebuchadnezzar, telling him that he himself is the tree, and essentially must renounce his sin and far-reaching dominion, placing God at the top of the order, not himself. As you might expect, all that the dream prophesies comes to pass. Nebuchadnezzar is chased from his home and forced to live amongst the land, the remains of his kingdom awaiting him. And when he does return, God is placed once more at the top of the order. While the Tree bears a lot of resemblance to other world tree myths, I find it really interesting to see a great tree mentioned in the Bible, however metaphorical, no less one that reflects the bounty of Marika's Age of Plenty, where blessings fell like golden tears. Marika's personal connection is also clear, being a ruler who would wield the power of an outer god for her own machinations, in the conquering of the lands between, and the solidification of her lineage, putting herself in many ways ahead of God, most evident in the actions that would end with her punishment and imprisonment. The Hornsent were crushed, the dragon's claim on her land repelled, and the giants and their fell god felled. The all that was in opposition to the Tree was pacified, the Tree being the object of Marika's faith by which it was achieved. In its prime, the Tree was abundant in blessings thanks to Marika, its figurehead, seen clearly in the Erdtree's favourite talisman. I'll save the language of blasphemy for other characters, but I don't think it's an unfair read to view Marika as selfish in her wielding of the Elden Ring. Maybe selfish is the wrong word, let's say conceited. And it is the same godforsaken conceit that Nebuchadnezzar is warned of by the angel. It is Radagon, her aspect in the other half, ordaining fundamental scientific truths of the world, who face the utmost shame upon Marika's shattering of the Elden Ring, laying a kingdom of not bronze and iron, but of gold, to ruin, just like Nebuchadnezzar's prophecy. Marika is not cast from her lands, however, but punished firsthand by her god, trapped within the tree, awaiting an Elden Lord. Daniel 5 is a hot pickup on Nebuchadnezzar's lineage, following his son, King Belshazzar, in the midst of entertaining his entire palace. But, running low on supplies, Belshazzar permits the gold and silver goblets from the temple to be brought in for serving. In this, the nobles have chosen to praise the old gods of gold, silver and bronze, rather than the singularity of the one god. It is here that Belshazzar, his wives and his concubines witness a disembodied hand writing on the walls of the palace in an undecipherable script. Belshazzar summons Daniel, the only one able to interpret the writing, who tells him that much unlike his father, Belshazzar has not humbled himself before God, and this is the reason for the hand's visit. The inscription warns Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, which meant that the days of his reign were to be numbered. He had been judged and found wanting, and his kingdom was to be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Belshazzar praises Daniel's insight, but that very night he is slain all the same, the prophetic words bestowed by the disembodied hand from the heavens coming to pass. In this story, it feels as though we have a direct trace to where Elden Ring pulls its imagery of the two fingers from, also literal, disembodied hands that share the script with the divine. The hand of God is a motif that appears in a lot of religious art, but this story really feels like a direct inspiration, especially when we consider the origin of the two fingers and those who interpret them, as does the wise Daniel, so does Goldmask. So why have we spent the first 10 odd minutes taking part in Bible study? I hope it's clear enough to you as it is to me how much these stories parallel a lot of what went into Elden Ring, and that by drawing from them, we can not only see the root of Miyazaki's influences, but also inform ourselves deeper as to why things are the way they are in-game, as well as broach its themes on a deeper level. After all, we're here to talk about the body, and as I said before, for me, a big part of esoteric theology is to answer the metaphysical questions of the body. And the great virtue of Elden Ring is that we get to explore these questions in a very literal sense. There is no ambiguity to the actuality of the things that have occurred in the lands between and in its shadow. Well, okay, there's ambiguity in as much as we're constantly piecing together the narrative from primary and secondary sources. But more to the point, this is a world where we can see very clearly that parallel hands of God are real, tangible things, escaping the Old Testament's pages and Rembrandt's brush. And that when God's creations act up, the bodies made within his own image, it is up to him and his kingdom to set it right, be it messages from angels or mystical hands inscripting esoteric warning. Okay, thank you for taking this little preamble detour with me. Now, let's get into some made-up video game lore. In the first video, I argued that the body could be seen everywhere, be it in physical exploration or metaphorically in identity and self. There's a few characters I didn't have a chance to fully get into last time, so I'll quickly shine the spotlight on some of the leftovers. I'm really surprised I didn't talk about Morgott and Mohg in that first video. These demigod twins are the cursed children of Marika and Godfrey, who were shunned and hidden under the capital for their Omen curse. The curse being an exhibition of crucible traits, something we know was regarded with great disdain in the time of Marika. How could the symbol of golden humanity give life to progeny that bore the flag of her greatest enemy? The game takes great care to make explicit reference to the fact that it is their blood that is accursed, which has all kinds of implications. Elden Ring is well known to take hereditary disease and mutation to its extremes. Without a mother's love, the twins looked elsewhere. Morgott took comfort in the Erdtree, the land's phallic beacon of motherhood, and when made free during the shattering, it is Morgott who, under the boughs of the great tree, takes claim to Lindell as the veiled monarch, a necessary concealing of his self, for how could someone whose body of perceived impurity ever hope to rule the Golden Kingdom? Mohg's story takes a slightly different trajectory, one that paints him as a villain, but not really at any fault of his own. I don't really blame Mohg for seeking the warmth of an outer god during his imprisonment in the aptly named Formless Mother, worship that is elaborated on in the Land of Shadow. In the Omen-born twins, there is a literal exploration of body and the game's pre-existing fixation on the control of the aforementioned, as well as internal explorations of self, and our innate desire for, well, the warmth of a mother. And for Moog, I love that this comes from something formless, considering form is pretty much half of what we've endeavoured to talk about. It's extra pointed when we consider that Moog's actual mother rejects him because of his form. Well, that's okay, Moog. There's an omnipresent mother around that you can stab with your big ritual spear whenever you feel like. Because of the Mother of Truth, Moog felt no need to shy away from his Omen traits, whereas we see Morgoth hide behind his two identities, the Veiled Monarch and Margit, the Fell Omen, the latter employing his shame to wage war against those who would dare rise to the Erdtree's challenge. His character model shows just how far this rejection goes, with some of his horns around his brow line having been removed and shaved down. One thing I want to point out is that this really reveals Marika's cruelty, who went so far as to actually chain down and shackle her children purely because of the characteristics they possess. Marika sounds more and more like a bitter eugenicist with each passing day. In Morgoth, we see one of the few times a father's love is ever shown to the player. Before the burning Erdtree, as we come face to face with Godfrey for the first time, we see him passing a moment caressing Morgoth's now mortal, aged body. As he fades to dust, Godfrey says,
"Long and hard didst thou fight."
A fitting statement for Tarnished and Omen alike. Before we move on, I'd like to quickly raise another religious parallel that we can see in the Hornsent and by extension, the Omen-born. Pointed out to me by user BeansandRice321, part of Elden Ring's issue with horns as a whole can actually find a root in religious history. Through a possible mistranslation in about 130 CE, Moses was thought to have been a horned figure, receiving them upon his communion with God after his ascension to Mount Sinai. Much like the Hornsent who once made contact with the Crucible, the primordial energies of the Elden Ring, receiving in return a blend of animal characteristics, detested in Marika's age. Wikipedia tells me that horns generally had positive associations in the Old Testament, but were viewed negatively in the New Testament, with interpretations of this scene shifting away from giving Moses horns and instead replacing them with two beams of light, occurring throughout the medieval ages through to the Renaissance. This gives us a really nice parallel to the Age of the Crucible and the Age of the Erdtree, where here too, where these traits once looked upon with divinity, and then with disdain and notions of impurity, ultimately resulting in Marika's choice to leave two of her own children chained up in the dark, bereft of light. Renalla, I think, is my favourite character in the whole game, so again, I'm really surprised I didn't bring her up in the first video. She is the first wife of Radagon, a marriage that ended the Leonian Wars, unifying the House of Gold with the House of Stars. The tall, elongated and immobile Carrion Queen evokes our principal theme in a myriad of ways. Physically, she reminds us of the inept and impaired Albinaurics, one of the game's many attempts to wield a mastery over life. And it is Renalla who uses her Angel's Egg, Amber Egg, a gift from Radagon on his departure from Leonia to become Marika's escort, to facilitate player respecking and rebirth. The egg also appears to have been responsible for Renalla's numerous sweetings littered all around her boss room, who too harken back to the feeble Albinauric lifeforms. Why rebirth doesn't make us invalid? Well, that's likely a gameplay reason, but we do present her with the living amniotic sac fetus thing that is a larval tear, which may be why our rebirth is a little less tragic. The larval tear comes from the Silver Tears of the Eternal City, the game's ancient civilization who sought the means to forge their own lord, and who, just like the Carrions, revered the moon. Renalla's personal story is one of heartache, and in her distraught madness, we see her endeavour to rebirth herself anew, seeking comfort in its amnesiatic, restful slumber. There is great tragedy in the rest of what we can infer for Renalla. Trapped in the academy following a revolt during the Shattering, not one of her demigod brood seemed to care about their mother's fate. I guess Radahn was busy fighting stars, and Rykard was busy being eaten by a giant snake. Ranni does protect Renalla in some way, summoning a spirit of her mother at a peak during the second phase of her fight, but otherwise the Queen of the Moon is left much to her own devices. Renalla introduces the conflicting notions of the mother found in Elden Ring, where we are reminded of the singular eternal matriarch versus personal family. Looking towards others found in Renalla's academy, we see bodies again and again. Students like Selin the Graven Witch study the primeval current, the pursuit of which for some reason always ends up with you turning into an amalgamation of glintstone masks, a seed of stars. We see reference to this primeval current in dialogue with Selin and items like the Amber Draught and Amber Starlight Shard, magical items that, unlike the blue hues of glintstone, are rich in amber, similar to the colour of divinity in the Golden Order, and more specifically, the Crucible in its primordial form. I want to quickly dive into the primeval current here because it's one of Elden Ring's more mysterious and esoteric concepts, and reveals more of Miyazaki's intentioned emphasis on the body. Ymir tells us that we began as stardust, born of a great rupture far across the skies. We too are children of the greater will. Is that not divine? Is that not sublime? And yet none can fathom its implications, its utter brilliance. This dialogue suggests a possible origin for man that aligns with the real-world idea of the Big Bang. In Elden Ring's case, many interpret this as the rupturing of the One Great, which spread stardust, life across the cosmos. This in turn sheds light on the primeval current and glintstone as a whole, as a cosmic and underlying force that is part of the makeup of man. Whether or not Sellen knew the finer points of glintstone origin, it begs to wonder how deeper insight into the primeval current results in a total transmutation of form. To me, it feels like the fundamental DNA of being is being tampered with, especially interesting given that Lusat and Master Azur both are described to have lost their heads, brains and eyes entirely, replaced with crystal, the essence of which, as we have so often been told, contains life. Sorcerer Sellen puts it this way.
Glintstone is the amber of the cosmos. Golden amber contains the remnants of ancient life and houses its vitality, while glintstone contains residual life and thus the vitality of the stars. It should not be forgotten that glintstone sorcery is the study of the stars and the life therein, a fact lost on most sorcerers these days.
I've been thinking a lot about the fundamental primeval energy of amber stars and glintstone, and I've had a vision of an interpretation that is maybe a little bit crazy, but I feel like sharing it anyway. During research, I became fixated on the dual colours of the amber and the blue glintstone, and in a sudden burst of clarity I saw this. If we follow the thinking that the amber stars were part of the rupture of the One Great caused by the Greater Will, I wonder if there's a way to interpret these stars as part of the One Great's life force, its blood. I was thinking about the way blood changes colour as it's exposed to air, from scarlet red to a much deeper, darker colour. And when I think about this, I see the amber stars, distinct from glintstone, yet one and the same. Far away from the cosmos, immersed in the airs and energies of the lands between, it is oxidized, and as such is deeper and darker in colour. This appears geologically too in-game, in the Verdigris set that appears in the DLC, a strange metal that is said to be the gift of an outer god, and in reality, the consequence of atmospheric oxidization in copper and brass. And for glintstone, I interpret it as following a similar logic. Does my theory reign true for you, or do you have any other ideas on this? I would really love to hear other theories and interpretations, so please leave it in the comments. Okay, I spent way longer on this than I intended to, but there's one more thing I'd like to highlight. As part of Sorcerer Sellen's questline, you learn that the person you've been talking to is a puppet, and that Sellen has replaced her heart with one made of glintstone. We've seen puppets before in that Preceptor Celavis who we looked at in the last video. But as far as I know, Sellen is the first time we see in-game the intricacies of this practice. As in, what goes into the process of making a puppet. I think we can tie this into everything we just explored. If amber starlight is this DNA-like substance, cosmic blood that makes up our very being, it seems reasonable to say that this is what goes into controlling bodies in the lands between. What I'm really trying to suggest is that this implies glintstone to be in part natural code, and by ingesting the astral ones and zeros, we've enabled ourselves to be controlled by another, and, well, turn into a giant mass of energy. To take this one further, stars are constantly referred to as arbiters of fate in the lands between. Arrested by Radahn, and if you recall our quest, by this very measure, the fate of our mistress Ranni cannot continue, something told to us by Sellen. Though fate is a conceptual idea, it is personified in the Greek pantheon of gods, and here in Elden Ring, the celestial bodies of stars are revered in the same way, with great certainty, because it's a made-up game, and it's as real as it tells us. But in this, I think we have a through line for the primordial current as genetic matter that comes from the One Great and the Greater Will, thus enabling it to command our lives as fates, and in the layers between, allowing individual hubris to make slaves of their fellow tarnished. That was way more than I intended to talk about on the matter of glintstone and the primeval current. I really hope that made sense. Like, any sense at all. Let's move on to someone else. I would be remiss to not bring up Bok the Seamster here, a demi-human at the side of the tarnished who finds great comfort in recounting stories of his mother, whose love and encouragement set him upon the path of seamster.
Do you think that Mum would be pleased if she knew that I'm as good as any royal seamster now?
A love that he misses dearly. When we meet him though, Bok lacks self-assurance and shows great shame in his demi-human form, for there is little place in the Golden Order for such a creature. Nonetheless, the Tarnished journey takes you both to Lindell, where Bok asks about the Academy and Renalla's ability to bequeath rebirth. Last time we talked about what happens when we give Raya the answers she was looking for, or simply giving in to her mother's desire to protect her from the tainted nature of her birth by administering a tonic of forgetfulness. A lot can be said for the way Miyazaki explores the love of the mother, the natural creator and protector of Spawn, before God and order. We want to protect those we love, and this feeling is exemplified by Elden Ring's mothers, surrogate and natal. Tanith, who would keep Raya safe from dark truths, Renalla, who obsesses over her sweetings, and the gentle comforts of Bok's mother. Contrast this against the demands of kindling that Marika asks of her daughter Melina, and the endless task of crusade thrust upon Messmer. Rejecting who Bok really is leaves him a harrowing fate, one where his failure to accept himself leaves him a hollow husk. For who are we, if not ourselves? Resisting the temptation and telling Bok that he's beautiful.
You're beautiful.
The same comfort granted by his mother doesn't give the player anything ceremonious, other than the knowledge that you provided a small comfort to one of the many myriad of diverse creatures that make up the lands between, all who belong, regardless of any doctrine that might suggest impurity. After all, no god can vibrate the air with nostalgia and love like the vocal cords of a mother. I really like how Bok's little quest marries together literal exploration of the body and questions of identity that are rampant in game, while also our budding themes of birth, motherhood and religion. Contrast this against what befalls Selen upon completing her research into the primeval current. She becomes a seed of energy, devoid of the teacher who guided so many players on their first steps through the lands between, devoid of herself. I feel like I prefaced every character so far with, I don't know why I didn't talk about this the first time, but Malenia really surprises me. Her entire story revolves around the body and being, made even more obvious when we look at her twin, Miquella, who, before the DLC, was known as the Unalloyed. Malenia and Miquella were both Empyreans with the potential to succeed Marika, but thanks to the peculiar nature of their birth, to what Smotown puts as the Rebus, they were both born afflicted. In Malenia's case, this was the curse of rot, and for Miquella, this was the curse of eternal childhood. I do wonder what it is about their self-sensuous birth that enables Outer Gods access to their very being, beyond the game's mirroring of hereditary and incestuous disease. The body of Malenia is eaten away by her curse, only kept at bay by Miquella's needle. She's made no weaker for it, however. In spite of having to use a prosthesis, she has never known defeat. For Malenia, the body is of little consequence. Her Clean Rot Knights reflect this by having accepted their fate at the Battle of Ionia, fighting for as long as the Scarlet Rot eating away at them will allow. Perseverance and persistence being key parts of their approach to the body, pushing it where others may have succumbed. Contrast is against Miquella, who wants nothing more than to save the body of his sister from the rot that is consuming it. But perhaps more importantly in the physical vessel itself is her mind and her soul, which we know can be withered away by Scarlet Rot. We see this in parts of her Great Rune, scarred by Scarlet. When we fight Malenia, we see the toll that keeping the Scarlet Rot at bay has taken on her, and her new potential when it is finally unlocked. Something I find really interesting is that as the goddess of rot, we see something particular of the body. As far as I know, this is the only time the game shows us the body as unadorned as this, until we get to Marika's crumbling self at the end of the game. More to the point, we are shown how irrelevant her aspects of her womanhood are, as the icons of reproduction in our own world are covered by scarlet scales. We know, as a rule, that these things are largely unimportant in the lands between, because as we explored in the first video, births are usually pursued through other means. Millicent, the budding amnesiatic daughter of Gowry, is a prime example of this, for she was discovered, a mere babe, by Gowry in the swamp of Ionia, sprouting after Malenia's battle with Radahn, a battle fought for Miquella, and when the Tarnished puts blade to Malenia, it is after a deep sleep in the base of the Halig tree. Sleep, we know, suggests of rebirth, and her bloom into the goddess of rot during a fight may well be the very result of this sleep. Above the arena are the roots of the Halig tree, Miquella's paradise for the discarded and unwanted bodies of the lands between. In the roots we can see Miquella's very essence, his form manifesting in the Halig tree's winding heart, which reminds you of the effigy of the grandmother found in Marika's former home. Miquella watered the tree with his blood, hoping to do what the Golden Order could not, ward off the outer god of rot entirely and cure his sister of her affliction. Though this failed to come to fruition, we imagine there is a small comfort to Miquella in the way in which his holy tree became a welcome retreat for those unluckiest in their lot. Miquella in the lands between is the setup for the charming, kind Empyrean we meet in the Land of Shadow. Before that, we also learn of St. Trina as a patron, whose captivating embrace was ever fleeting, and whose form was ever changing. Miquella is considered the most fierce of the demigods, before Radahn and before Malenia. Heavily inferred in the lands between is Miquella's ability to bewitch and literally charm the spirit, and the game makes a point to suggest that this is of greater consequence than the sharpest sword or the heaviest axe. We've talked at great length about the ways in which bodies can be strung up and souls manipulated, namely in the application of silver from the Nox, and the ways a primeval current facilitated Puppetry, Hercelibus and Selen. But in Miquella, this ability appears to be innate. I imagine part of why for so long he was described as unalloyed, for he clearly possesses the same ability granted by the amber and blue hues of glintstone that would enable the control of the heart, its colours perhaps unsullied by other gods. He is also born of eternal youth, and in possession of a gender-shifting aspect that portends a drunken, almost opium-like slumber, which is just another small comfort taken by those of poor fortune in the lands between. And Miquella's own eternal youth comes to embody much of the purity he represents, a purity that in the lands of shadow seeks to rend all onto equality of love, at the cost of personal faculty. But before this, he must take part in his own sleep, in his cocoon, awaiting his metamorphosis and ascension, but absconded with by Mohg, which takes us finally to the land of shadow. We'll be returning to Miquella the Kind soon, but before we get there, let's talk about a few notable faces from under the Scadu Tree's shade, whose bodies and identities remind us just how central these themes are to the game. Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame, first appears to us a feeble man, impaled by a sword, thrust through the entirety of his body, barbs keeping him perpetually suffering. The descent into the abyssal woods tells us plainly that this is a manse of madness. We didn't really explore this side of the One Great in the first part, but its importance is plain to see. The Shabriri grapes resemble swollen eyes, and the mission of Frenzy shows us again the body is a vessel, given up and employed as agents of outer gods. Hyeta was once Arena of Morn, and Shabriri was once Bloody Finger Hunter Yura, followers and prophet taken to their extreme. Now they are followers of the Three Fingers. Tarnished archaeologist makes a fantastic theological comparison in the use of the 2 and 3 fingers as godly envoys, and a split in the Catholic Church on the use of 2 or 3 fingers when making the signs of the cross. The former representing the dual nature of Christ as divine and human, and the latter representing the Trinity. In Elden Ring's case, there is an impression that the 2 and 3 fingers may have once created a whole hand, both originating from the same One Great, which we know is said to have been ruptured by the Greater Will, creating life and its suffering, the genesis of Stardust. Hyeta is blind and comes closer to seeing the light behind her dead eyes with every consumption of a grape, and Shabriri, the first known follower of the Flame of Frenzy, is described as having had his own eyes gouged out for his crimes, which of course is of little consequence of the Flame of Frenzy, instead enabling it to fester within his sockets. And forget not of Vike, who was swayed by the Three Fingers' promise that his finger maiden might be spared the fate of kindling. Where Lord and Consort are the job of the duality of sex, kindling the fire, which brings forth renewal, is the job of women exclusively. Returning to Midra, we see he is left by the horn scent, impaled by the sword of damnation. Naturally, worship of the frenzied flame, a force that would melt away all life and all spirits, does not align with the Crucible's gift of life, a result of the Greater Will split from the One Great, which I may or may not have mentioned in this video. After a good beating to a pulp from the Tarnished, Midra removes the spear, begging forgiveness from his dearest Renalla. The Lord of Frenzied Flame is a sight to behold, and in his madness has literally forgone his head, in its place, the burning eye of frenzy. The imagery is pretty literal here, and honestly I can't stop coming back to the ideas we explored in the primeval current. We've seen so often how malleable the body is, and although perpetrated by a separate outer god, we see again these same principles, as well as another emphasis on the imagery of heads, eyes, and burning iris, filled with shimmering golden hues. Let's talk about Renalla for a second, because she's the one who told Midra to endure the suffering inflicted upon him by the Hornsent Crusaders. I'm kind of stuck on the community's assumed malice of her. Was she an agent of the Frenzied Flame, seeking Midra's endurance as a means to facilitate the ascension to Lord? Or is the endurance a means by which she is spared the unsheathing of the aforementioned force? Not super relevant to our investigation, but something I was thinking about. Regardless, just as Marika must house the Elden Ring to perpetuate her god's agenda, the Flame of Frenzy too needs its spawns. Miyazaki has always been interested in the notion of true sight, and succumbing to the total consumption of the Three Fingers' power is another one of the game's many examples where our investigation laps back into questions of the flesh. When the Tarnished makes their own communion with the outer god of frenzy, it is a three-fingered vassal that grabs our body, leaving the mark of its fingertips seared into our flesh. What we take away from all this is that, Like so many of Elden Ring's orders and societies, ascension involves the release of your body to a greater power. Messmer the Impaler is the figurehead of Marika's shrouded crusade against the Hornsent and has been trapped in the Hidden Realm, perpetuating her mission, all while the Golden Lineage was able to flourish and fall in the lands between. Messmer is another of Elden Ring's more elusive characters, with little concrete lore to help define him. We do know him to be another of Marika's cursed children, this time not inhabiting the dual elements of youth and decay, instead afflicted by the base serpent, the origins of which is probably Elden Ring's biggest mystery. Before we get into any of that, let's first look at Messmer's form, because there's some really interesting qualities present when he transforms into a serpent, that of eyes that protrude all over his body, even in his mouth. Without stating the obvious, Messmer has eyes on the inside, which no doubt harkens back to some of Miyazaki's other projects, and much of what we explored in this video, in how the game interprets eyes, vision and sight, as part of its central presentation of the body in all of its themes. Something else that is interesting is that, where Rykard had to feed his body to a snake to transform his own vessel, this is innate and inherent to Messmer, an affliction that seems to have existed since birth. So where has this base serpent come from? We know it to be closely linked to the Abyss, the great chasm of darkness that all life is said to have come from, or more so, where our outer gods are from. There's a lot of theological inspiration behind the use of snakes and its inference here. Last time we talked of Norse and Lithuanian myths that contribute to a lot of the serpent presence, respectively in the world serpent and Igle, whose betrothal to a snake ends in a betrayal and a transformation into trees. But more important than anything is how the serpent, reviled in the lands between, parallels its place in Genesis for its temptation of Adam and Eve. Except the temptress in Elden Ring is God. It is the greater will that would have Marika take from the Erdtree's plentiful bounty, that would have had her inter the Elden Ring into herself to ascend to godhood. Investigating the base serpent further takes us to the Bonnie village, where we see that at some point a snake had shed its skin there, before the O Mother statue, similar to what we see in the Church of Igle. It's hard to pinpoint what the snakeskin is doing there, but as we have come to know From Software, it wouldn't be there if they weren't trying to suggest something to us. And if we look towards other parts of the game, where the identity of the shaman is built up, we can see again how the signs point back towards the serpent. In Dominula village, just under Mount Gelmir, the tolerated remnants of the shaman, whom we know Marika originates from, practice their rituals, part of which involves cannibalism. In part 1, we looked at how this too is seen on Mount Gelmir, as a reflection of base hunger and blasphemy taking place under Rykard's own snake cult. As Mirko points out to us in their phenomenal essay on Marika's ascension, the presence of the snakeskin and its presence in Rykard's domain suggests a connection between the shamans of Marika's past, what remains of them in Dominula, and the snake cult. What we can safely infer is that the snake may well have been part of the old world practices, much in the same way the fell god once had claims to the land, and following the thread through, we see how Marika may well have had to turn her back on part of the religious practice that would have made up part of her old life, yet never free from it entirely, given how we see it infest her secreted away son Messmer. While we're talking about shaman practice and snakes, I'm reminded of how the Gates of Divinity seem to find their strengths in the rituals of the shaman, given the exchanging of blood that we see during the DLC story trailer, something that aligns with these long forgotten, almost pagan-like practices of the shaman. I'll quickly remind you of the blood that goes into the creation of the effigy of Miquella in the Halig tree, and by extension, the grandmother in the shaman village. Elden Ring spends a great deal exploring the nuances and intricacies of the ways that religion, gods and pantheons are forever changing, and Messmer and the base serpent seem to be part of that. And so is the very nature of Marika's malleable shaman flesh that would make her such a successful candidate for housing the Elden Ring, enabling her to spearhead such dramatic religious change in the world. I see in this rambling an opportunity to answer a long-standing question of mine on Radagon and his redhead heritage. I don't know why I never thought of this before, because as I say this now it appears painfully obvious. If Malenia and Miquella are born susceptible to the meddling of outer gods, it stands to reason that Marika's aspect, born of herself, is at the same mercy, that it really is the fell god lingering within Radagon's red locks, the likes of which he is said to have detested, for it stands against all he came to embody in his pursuit of Golden Order fundamentalism. It says a lot for his own conviction that this possible connection never shook him, like in the case of Malenia's rot, but we do see how it affected others in the Order, in the visions of fire seen by both Malenia and Messmer, who we assume are born of Radagon, but have both been shrouded by Marika. Malenia's body is covered in burns, the same vessel that would serve as kindling in the giant's flame, fueling what remains of the fell god's influence in the lands between. And Messmer wages an endless crusade in the Land of Shadow, hunting the Hornsent with effigies of the deity that has long haunted their own saga. On the surface, it can be viewed simply as a means to humiliate and terrorize his opponents, but when Messmer's association with fire is so clearly displayed, I find it hard to not see this outer god influence present in him, and his snakes too, an influence that had to be held back by Marika's Scar Seal of Grace, a ward that took the place of one of Messmer's eyes. Eyes are a massive part of the game's language, and one thing I guess I'll point out now is that we never see Marika's own eyes in game, ever, which is fascinating considering what they reflect and suggest of others, as the seed of grace, life, and gods. My initial writing of this section had me suggest that snakes were part of the Fell God's pantheon, but I lost confidence in this theory and, as you will have just heard, revised this section to highlight something I felt was stronger, which was a simpler connection to shaman practices of old. I still think there's something to be said for how often they brush up against each other, like how we see a serpentine beast on the brazier of the flames, awaiting its chance to burn away the remnants of the Erdtree and begin the cycle anew. The same brazier that is tended to by the last of the fire giants, kept subservient after the Fell God is removed from the lands, Marika's concession to the greater will, fire being the natural enemy of both the new and the old Hornsent order. That's all I have to say on that for now. I still think there's something I'm missing in who the snakes actually align with or where they really come from. At the very least, I hope there's something someone can pick out from this. Maybe not Godwin or Anakipu. And so, finally, we return to the sinistral Messmer, who is not kept warm by the love of his mother, but instead by the twin serpents, evocative of the helix, foundational to the Hornsent. Everything we've just outlined before is central to Messmer and brought forward by his own character, in his descent from Radagon and his fell red disdain, and his embodiment of outer god aspects, the same susceptibility found in Marika's other children, literally embodying the way in which religion shifts against the pushes and pulls of wills found throughout history. More than anything though, without getting bogged down in heavily obfuscated lore, Messmer is a character who has been long suffering because of the will of others, and reminds us of the lengths at which we go for ambition, for love, and for warmth. I think what we need to recognise in Miquella comes from this line of dialogue from a phantom. Kindly Miquella, I see you've thrown away something you should not have, under any circumstances. How will you salvation offer to those who cannot be saved, when you could not even save your other self? Here we acknowledge firsthand that Miquella's plan will grant no solace, no less by an individual who would discard the literal embodiment of boundless love and gentle embrace, who, by the way, has been seen in the lands between to inhabit the most literal expression of the third eye, contrary to the more subtle expression of divinity seen in the Great Will's imposition on vision, of grace and of the Erdtree, opposed again by the burning chaos of the Eye of Flame. At one time, perhaps, this was a simple middle ground for common people. Which I guess is part of the great irony of our youthful, sleepy would-be saviour, that the idealised hero who has been in the background of the entire base game and at the forefront of the DLC would come to be viewed as such a villain, that Miquella could truly abandon the embrace of Trina, left to putrescence. I'm fascinated by the way she carries Miquella's doubts, yet also his love. Aren't we supposed to pursue the latter with total disregard of the former? So then, what is the cost for this imagined future? Of course we think of Grithis, who would give up this closest to him for a single chance at paradise, but we can't help but look back at all the people before, who have tread through the darkness of this world, testament to the strength of our souls, who rise at every chance to carry the boulder. But to really understand it, we need to look at what Miquella's 1,000-year voyage onto compassion really means, and how it mirrors so much of what is uncovered in the DLC. As Scadutree on Twitter rightly points out, harmonious melding was a massive part of Crucible era worship and was linked to the notion of divinity, going all the way back to the old cosmic order of the One Great. This assimilation into oneness is the very force that would deny each individual their own instrumentality, their own free will, which in part is why the flame of frenzy is portrayed so negatively in the game, that it would burn away the gift of ensoulment. We see this very display again in the Seeds of Stars, glintstone sorcerers flying too close to the primeval current, again portrayed with darkness and tragedy in-game, because in these Seeds of Stars, the individual is undone. And what Miquella's ultimate framing as a villain that needs putting down reveals is that his end goal is no different. Miquella's ambition is misguided, misinterpreting the imposition of the suffering wrought by the world order and the celestial bodies that would influence it. No, in spite of God's benevolent wisdom and indifferent cruelty, we, the children of stars, born of its grace, march forever on, through epochs of gold, and ages of darkness. It's not a resignation to fate, but an acceptance. I personally don't think that a blanket of charmed compassion that would rid all of the chance to live as best they can is the right course of action. It makes me think of the all-encompassing hive mind in Pluribus, or the human instrumentality of Evangelion. The mistakes are ours alone to make. What of the soothing words of a comforting mother? What of the promises made to each other? What of the personal love for those we care for? What is it under a blanket of unity that would push all towards one singular common goal? These things do not exist under the force of will. The assimilation of souls that Miquella would conjure under his charm may evoke peace, but it also nullifies all other feeling. The very feelings that would make a bonded promise of Radahn, that would labour endlessly to save a sister from a festering rot, that would see to the needs of the lesser, and provide, at least for a time, succour under his branches. Is it better to have been against the cruel indifference of existence? To have had even the chance to hold those little moments of love, beauty, joy, sadness, pain and hurt so close? This is what I see in Miquella's tale, a story filled with so many attempts to right the wrongs of those who sought to impose themselves onto the lands between, ironically repeating the same mistake. The warmest embrace ends up the coldest mercy. Charged with the body, afforded little against the cycles of life, all we can endeavour to do is to be. And there ends my ramble on the body and theology in Elden Ring. I hope it is now as apparent to you as it is to me how Miyazaki has used the body in the storytelling and visual language of the game. That the core philosophy of Elden Ring really is a simple story of agency, soul and self-determination, which is much of what we see in the pursuit of theology, attempts to answer the hows and whys of it all. The nice part of Elden Ring is that we don't have to do any guesswork. Well, no existential guesswork anyway. We did move slightly away from the game's more literal expressions of body and its constant transitions in this one, for the more metaphysical notions of self, but regardless, it is warmth that the body craves. Warmth of creators, mothers, friends, and home. Thank you so much for making to the end of this video. I'm going to try and talk a little bit off script like I did at the end of my Silent Hill one, just for fun. So let's do this. So first off, I just want to say, I can't believe how long this took me. I always say that at the end of the video, but this one took me forever. I had a lot of stuff going on in my life. I was changing job and trying to figure some things out. And I also got a tongue piercing while I was writing this video. And part of why this is taking so long, I had to re-record the entire script because I didn't realize I had this horrible lisp while it was healing. You can probably still hear it here and there in the video. Apologies, there's like a little clacking sound every now and then. That's just gonna be there now because of this piece of metal in my mouth. I also got really sick while I was making this, and you can hear sort of halfway through the video my delivery changes because I'm ill and I'm still am currently recovering from an illness. But I'm sorry, I just had to record this because I need this to be done. So yeah. Whatever, the video is done, finally, hooray. More than anything, I want to apologize for how messy some of the sections are. One, I think the Messmer bit is a total mess. I barely talk about him, and I go on some real crazy tangents, but whatever, I think there's something to be gained from it, I guess. And also the ending about Miquella the Kind that's basically just a conclusion. It's a little bit rushed, so I apologize for not going super in depth. I wonder if I should have just made these smaller videos. I mean, I'm so self-conscious. I mean, we'll see how people find it, but can't believe I spoke for like 5 minutes at the start about Bible stories. I find that interesting. I hope others do too, but I feel it's a bit rogue. Maybe that should have just been a quickie little video, but again, we'll just have to see how this one does. Yeah, I'm sorry, you have to listen to me being really self-conscious about my video, but the next couple of videos are probably not going to be at Elden Ring at all, and I really hope people stick around for those, because I have a very broad interest in games and culture and nerdy things, and I would love it if anyone sat here and listened to me talk about it. So expect something a bit different next time. Again, thank you so much for listening. It's such a joy to get to do this, and I hope that I get to keep doing it because it makes me quite happy, even when the video takes me so long to get out. Okay, thank you. I love you. Goodbye.